Well, my name is Matt Holian. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Economics, and my job is to welcome you to the third and final provocative lecture for the spring 2013 semester, and to introduce our speaker, Ed Lopez. Through the provocative lecture series, the Department of Economics invites students, faculty, and the general public to consider intellectual arguments on controversial topics. Presenters are noted for outstanding scholarship and public speaking ability. This series fosters the tradition of higher education to challenge ideas and develop critical thinking skills in an environment of respect for intellectual discourse. Our goal is that you engage critical thinking skills to reach your own informed position on controversial issues. We invite you to attend, to relax, to ponder, and to enjoy the thought process. Our speaker today, let me make a few announcements before I say a few words about our speaker. We have a bar stool meeting immediately after this lecture, and that will be at Flames. So please join us to continue the discussion at Flames. If you would all take a moment to turn off your cell phones, make sure that they are in the off or vibrate position. And we also have books that Professor Lopez has brought with him, and this is my copy of his book, which he very kindly signed for me today. And he has special pricing for students, $10, and $20 for non-students. And you can find them right outside the hall here. And pardon me?
Cash only or credit card?
I believe cash only. And check, cash or check. And the proceeds will benefit the Econ Club. Professor Lopez was on the faculty at San Jose State for, I believe, 7 years, and I had the good fortune to get to know him during that time. And I have a lot of respect for him on a personal level, but also on a professional level. So I could mention many of the reasons why, but I think I'll just mention maybe 3. So first of all, Ed was recently elected to be the president of the Public Choice Society. This society is over 50 years old, and past presidents of the society include numerous Nobel Prize winners. So it's a very impressive accomplishment. His book, Mad Men, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers, was published, I believe, last year by Stanford University Press. And there is a journal, Public Choice, and Professor Lopez is one of the very few people have published more articles in that journal than him. So he's an all-around amazing scholar, and I'm very much looking forward to the talk that he'll give tonight. So without further ado, welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks everybody for spending your time this way this evening. And thanks for joining me. On a personal note, this is a nice homecoming for me. It's been a year and a half almost since I left this valley for the mountains of western North Carolina. And coming back into town yesterday and walking around downtown, seeing a lot of the familiar things that I used to call my home, it brought back a lot of it brought to a lot of rings of familiarity, welcome rings of familiarity to me, and it's just been really enjoyable. And I could say even more so about the people compared to the environs. It's good to be back, and thanks for joining me for a bit of a homecoming, if you will. I think that I kind of ripped off San Jose State in a little bit of a way, because all of the work that I did on this book was while I was sitting on chairs here on campus and at my home here nearby. But as soon as, right before the book was going to press is when I moved to Western Carolina University. So inside is the jacket cover. It lists me at Western Carolina and not at San Jose State. Matt's right. It came out about a year ago. I think its 1-year birthday was this week, if you want to think about it that way. But the publishing business has this interesting set of tricks up their sleeve, and so during the calendar year, if a book comes out after a certain point in the calendar year, it's somewhere around September or October. The copyright date gets forwarded up 1 year. So the copyright date is actually 2013. So I can tell you it's a new book. It's just out this year. Yeah. But excuse me. What I'd like to do for a little while today is talk to you partly about the book, but more so about some of the implications of the book for ordinary folks, for students, for teachers, for preachers, for parents, for neighbors, and so forth. I think that there's a sense of politics being done by rulers in faraway capitals. But I'd like to challenge that concept. I'd like to challenge that notion and say that politics starts in rooms like this, and in your classrooms, and in your churches and synagogues, and at your dinner tables, and at flames, at barstool meetings. And the reason I believe that is because politics is so influenced by ideas. And when people are with each other and communicating with each other, what are they communicating to each other, with each other? They're communicating ideas. Now, that's a very general statement to make, and people communicating ideas to each other takes numerous specific forms. Sometimes those are academic ideas. Sometimes those are just sort of hunches and beliefs. But in some way or another, they all have their impact on what happens in that area of life that we call politics. So I'd like to make the couple of points about the book first. The title is Madmen, Intellectuals, and Academic Scribblers, subtitled The Economic Engine of Political Change. Those three sets of characters, I'll explain a little bit about who they are in just a few moments. But it's the first point I want to make is how those three sets of characters combine as political entrepreneurs who advance different ideas for the way things ought to be done. And when they are victorious, they defeat the way things are currently being done. They surmount a status quo. They surmount the status quo. And when they do that, when political entrepreneurs advancing different sets of ideas, when they defeat the status quo, that's what I call political change. The second point I'd like to make, though, is that you don't have to be one of those sets of characters to influence political change. And that will be bringing us to the point about ordinary folks communicating with each other. Now, along the way, Matt mentioned the Public Choice Society and me being a public choice scholar. The book really is rooted in public choice scholarship. The implications that I'd like to discuss with you also are rooted in public choice scholarship. So along the way, I'd like to give you a sense of how public choice theory can be useful as a way of thinking about how people go about effectuating political change, how people go about coordinating their efforts collectively to solve problems in the social sphere. This is important to me, and I hope to convey a little bit of that importance to you, because public choice theory often is known as this body of thought that explains why government is always screwed up, why governments tend not to work according to what their objectives are, why particular public policy programs veer off their stated intentions and instead create all sorts of unintended consequences, the sum total of which make the program a net drain on society instead of a contribution to society. Public choice has been known as a theory of government failure. And the reason why it's important for me to use public choice theory as a foundation here is because I'm way more optimistic than that. I've been called the optimistic public choice guy. Sometimes not in a friendly way. Yeah. And I think that the optimism comes from using public choice theory to understand not how governments can be fixed, but instead how government programs can be circumvented. If they're failing, individuals communicating with each other, working with each other, figuring out solutions collectively, can circumvent and even subvert government failure, the top-down programs that come to us from faraway capitals. And that happens at the individual level. College students, parents, teachers, preachers, artists, and so forth. So with that intro, let me get going here a little bit. And I'll get going by first making the first of the 3 points that I want to make. That first is political change occurs only when ideas trump interests. So political change means we go from one set of institutional arrangements to a different set. We go from the status quo to something different. Now, Wayne and I, my co-author and I, we're not the first ones to think about political change this way. And I want to just delve a little bit into some history of economic thought with you. Because the history of economic thought is important in the same way that history is important. It repeats itself a lot. Here's John Maynard Keynes, writing in the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. He says ideas are important. They're more powerful than is commonly understood. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Boy, if you're an academic scribbler, this is really a confidence booster, you know. But what Keynes is saying here is he's saying, you know, I wrote this book and it's got a whole set of ideas about how the economy works, and those ideas are radically different from the way most people think about how the economy works. And he's self-reflective. He says, are these ideas going to matter? And he says, yeah, they're going to matter. In a few years, the madmen in authority will be heeding these ideas, even if they don't recognize it. That's not the end of the passage. The very, very last sentences of the book, he says ideas are even more important than vested interests, which are the power of which are vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. Sooner or later, it's ideas, not vested interests, that are dangerous for good or evil. How prophetic was that, huh? Yeah. Keynes is talking about vested interests. I want to just give you a little bit of a flavor, some examples of the status quo vested interests. Who are these vested interests? I'm going to introduce a term here. Many of you will recognize it. Some of you might recognize it and not know exactly how to work with the term. Some of you won't recognize it. The term is rent-seeking. Who among you, by show of hands, who knows this term? Ah, good. You've been taking Professor Holian's classes, and Professor Means, and Lydia, and so forth, and Professor Pogozinski. This is a term that can be defined quite generally as people investing valuable resources into unproductive uses, unproductive activities. The investment of valuable resources, people's time, their human capital, tax dollars, into activities that are a net drain instead of a contribution to the human condition. Here's one example. Sugar growers. Congress protects domestic sugar growers through import tariffs and a series of price supports. And as a result, all sugar consumers, you and me and basically everybody, and all sugar-using industries pay higher prices for sugar. Now, the Government Accountability Office, which is no libertarian organization, did a cost-benefit study on this and showed that the costs are on net pretty big, a couple of $1 billion a year. Another example, corn growers. For about 7 years, corn growers had a subsidy in place that meant if they sold their corn to blenders of gasoline and ethanol, they could get a really good price. Why? Because the blenders were subsidized. I think it was 50 cents a gallon for every gallon of ethanol that they produced from corn. Now that subsidy was set when it was enacted, was subject to a sunset clause. And in 2012, it was coming up against that sunset clause. It was going to go away. Now, what did Big Corn do? They came and they said, we have a better idea. Let's continue this congressional mandate that certain number of gallons of fuel, certain proportion of gallons of fuel in the United States has to come from ethanol. Now, in 2008, that number was 9 million gallons. And by 2015, that number is 222 billion gallons. Rent seekers, taxi drivers, nothing against them. Some of my best conversations have been with taxi drivers. And they provide a vital service, especially if you're somebody like me who likes to enjoy the libations at Barstool Economist meetings. But if you follow the issue of ride sharing, and especially mobile apps that people can use to connect and ride share, taxi cab drivers came out in protest to those and attempted to convince city governments across the country to keep those companies and those apps illegal. It comes closer to home, though, literally. Homeowners. This form is the IRS Schedule A, which is an addendum to Form 1040. And line 10 on IRS Form Schedule A says home mortgage interest and points, what does it say? Points reported to you on Form 1098A. So the interest that I pay on my mortgage, I get to deduct that from my income on my tax return. And it's not just me, it's anybody who owns a mortgage, anybody who's paying on a mortgage. Now what's that do? It maintains the value, the price, market price of my house. Another thing it did was it made the market price of my house high for me in the first place when I bought it, right? But any attempts to repeal this, and the value of my house, along with others, will decrease by the commensurate value of that line on your tax return. And so last year, during the debates about tax policy, the repeal of the home mortgage interest deduction was on the table. And there was even a press release by some knee-jerk member of the House of Representatives coming out and saying, yeah, we're going to do something about this home mortgage interest deduction. You know what happened next? The National Association of Realtors, the National Association of Home Builders, and other representatives of homeowners in Washington, D.C., they went knocking on the door. They said, Mr. Congress, we don't think that's such a good idea. The next day, there was a press conference saying, we need to uphold the American dream, and we're going to keep that home mortgage interest deduction on the books. All right? So who are the vested interests? They are winners in past rent-seeking contests. They are groups of interests that are benefiting from the status quo sets of rules. And they are participants in the marketplace of ideas to uphold those rules, to prevent any change in those rules. They're the ones who are doing battle with the proponents of different ideas. Now, Keynes says that ideas matter and that they filter down into madmen and authority. But there's a middleman of ideas. And for that concept, we'll come to F.A. Hayek. We're still in the history of thought part. And F.A. Hayek has this term, a word that he defines in a sort of a unique way, intellectuals. Now, intellectuals, you might think, well, they're the folks wearing the tweed jackets and with the elbow patches, and they're smoking a pipe at the coffee shop, talking about Nietzsche. All right? Actually, that's professors. Intellectuals, Hayek says, are middlemen of ideas. He calls them second-hand dealers in ideas. He doesn't really mean it pejoratively. It sounds pejorative, but it doesn't really mean it. They're not the originators of ideas. They're not the academic scribblers who pen more or less original ideas. But they're versatile with abstract ideas, and they have a talent of repackaging those and presenting them for mass audiences in ways that are familiar to non-experts. And Hayek says these intellectuals play a really important role, and that's why we use the word intellectuals in the title of our book. He says the intellectuals decide what views and opinions are to reach ordinary folks, which facts are important enough to be told to us, and in what form and from what angle they are to be presented. There's little that the ordinary man of today learns about events or ideas except through the medium of this intellectual class. So if I'm saying that it's important what people are talking about when they're at the dinner table, in the classroom, in their churches, and so forth, then it's important to at least take Hayek's notion here seriously, that the views and opinions that ordinary folks have are influenced by this class of folks, these middlemen of ideas. And so we do that in the book. So that kind of gives you, that tells you who the intellectuals are. Now, going back even farther into the history of thought, John Stuart Mill, one of the towering figures in 19th century economics. And he's giving you a very stern look right now. And he says, you should be thinking more hard about this. You should be thinking harder about this. You should be thinking harder about Keynes telling you that it's just a matter of time before ideas have their consequences. You should be thinking harder about it than it's just a matter of what the intellectuals tell us that ordinary folks get their opinions from. He says you should be thinking harder because circumstances matter. Ideas on their own, he says, they're of very little consequence unless outward circumstances conspire with them. Ideas have in general no very rapid or immediate efficacy in human affairs, but when the right circumstances and the right ideas meet, the effect is seldom slow in manifesting itself. What Wayne and I are doing in the book is saying that political entrepreneurs notice these circumstances on the horizon, and they take advantage of those opportunities to introduce a new idea and defeat the status quo. Let's talk about a couple examples. Basketball fans in the room? Any basketball fans? Do you know the name Danny Biasone? What did Danny Biasone invent? If you've read the first chapter of the book, this is the story that we open the first chapter of the book with. Danny Biasone invented the 24-second shot clock. Why did he do that? Well, because back in the day, there was this thing called stall ball. And if a team was ahead by even 1 point late in the game, they could just play keep away and stop playing basketball. Nobody wants to watch that. And it happened to pro basketball, and it happened to college basketball. And the rule makers, the folks who decide what the rules of the game are, decided we have a problem on our hands. The value of our sport, the spectator value of our sport is going to go down. And so what they do, they turn their eyes to Danny Biasone, who in 1954, I believe it was, took the average number of shots in a game and divided that into the total number of seconds in a game and came up with 24. And he said, we should have a new rule. And that rule would be, if the offense doesn't shoot the ball within 24 seconds, turnover. Now, guess what happened? That gave a difference. That change in rules gave players and coaches a different set of incentives on how to play the game, a better set of incentives on how to play the game, a set of incentives that they would play the game in a way that people wanted to watch and pay for. And before you know it, CBS is paying billions of dollars to just broadcast the NCAA tournament. So that's a sports analogy. I think sports, understanding sports is the key to understanding life. So I think there's a lot to that analogy. But I think that also it's helpful to think about areas of political change that happen in politics, right? So Matt asked you to turn your cell phones off, right? When I was in college, that would have been a line in a science fiction book. There were no cell phones when I was in college. Even when I was in graduate school. When I first got my first cell phone in grad school, it was a flip, and it was about half the size of a brick. And I was like, I got to work out. I would change hands, so I could get a little workout. That's how heavy it was. And all it did was voice. And it was so astounding at the time. My professor's like, Lopez, what are you doing with a cell phone? Only drug dealers have cell phones, don't you? I said, Professor, times are changing. And you know why times are changing? Times are changing because of this man, Ronald Coase. What did Ronald Coase do? Well, he won the Nobel Prize in 1991. What did he win the Nobel Prize for? He wrote a paper in 1959. The title of the paper was called The Federal Communications Commission. And it was all about this federal agency that regulates how the airwaves are used. Who can use them? How can they use them? For what purposes, to what ends, and to what rewards? And you know what he said? He said, there's no reason we can't treat the radio frequency spectrum in the same way that we treat real property, land. And from that, he recommended we should privatize the airwaves. Now, that paper was not very well received at the time. But over the years, as professional economists began to be persuaded by the core ideas in that paper, and even as personnel at the Federal Communications Commission itself, many of whom were economists, began to sort of see how their counter-arguments to Coase were not holding up. The idea for spectrum license auctions began to take shape. Now, the idea for license auctions is, let's not have the Federal Communications Commission have essentially hold beauty contests to see who can use a particular band of the spectrum and then regulate how they can use it. Let's instead put a particular band of the spectrum up for an auction, and the highest bidder is the one who decides that bidder gets to use it. There's still some rules about how it can be used and so forth. But the main thing is, the idea was to shift from this centrally controlled command and control beauty contest system to more of a market mechanism. Now, the idea didn't really go as far as it would have until it became in the interests of what Keynes calls the madmen in authority. The madmen in authority. The first spectrum license auction occurred in 1993-94 when Bill Clinton was president. And that first auction brought in $7.5 billion. Now, in those days, deficits were, federal budget deficits were in the hundreds of billions. And so $7 billion to a deficit hawk like Bill Clinton was not chump change. And you know what Bill Clinton said? He said, I'd go anywhere for a check this big. He literally said that. There was a press conference at the FCC after the first auction, and they had one of those giant checks. And the FCC commissioner was there, and the Vice President Al Gore was there. And President Bill Clinton shows up at the FCC. You know how often that happens, where the sitting president goes to the FCC? Not very often. And so everybody had these huge smiles on their faces. And those smiles got even bigger when Clinton grabbed that check and said, I'd go anywhere for a check this big. It became in the interests of the madmen in authority to execute Coase's idea from 35 years before. And what was the consequence of that? Now we have this relatively open market where people have the incentive to invest in networks and in devices. And now we're sitting around with all of us are sitting around today with these little miracles in our pocket. Right? Political change, it kind of matters. One more, oops, there's the miracles. Yeah. I'll quickly give you one more example. First, let me ask you, how many of you have taken a flight on a commercial airline in your life? All right. Just about everybody, almost everybody, right? Now, if you were to have asked that question 2 generations ago, which in terms of the technology of jet travel is not that long ago, but in terms of the regulation of jet travel, it might as well be a lifetime ago. If you were to have asked that question 2 generations ago, the proportion of hands up to hands down would be flipped. Very few people would have said, yes, I've taken a commercial flight. And the reason for that is because of this guy, Alfred Kahn. Alfred Kahn was an economics professor at Cornell University. And when President Jimmy Carter when it came time for President Jimmy Carter to appoint the chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board, he nominated Alfred Kahn. And Alfred Kahn, so he went from being an academic scribbler at Cornell to being something of an intellectual and also something of a madman in authority because he was the chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board. What did the Civil Aeronautics Board do? They regulated prices and routes in the commercial airline industry. They said what prices airlines could charge customers to fly from point A to point B in the country. And the way it worked is the prices tended to be not very competitive. They tended to be actually quite high. We know that for a couple of reasons. One way we know that was because the CAB only regulated interstate flights that crossed state boundaries, not intrastate. So if you looked at a flight from San Francisco to LA, it's about the same distance as a flight from, say, Boston to DC. But the Boston-DC one crosses state boundaries, and so that one's regulated by the CAB. Consumers were paying twice as much for the Boston to DC one as they were for the San Francisco to LA one. And so Alfred Kahn, he sort of beat down everybody's door. He said, we got to change the rules. We got to make the market more competitive. And what happened was a madman in authority got into the mix. He got a hold of the idea. And he saw an opportunity for himself to make a name for himself early in his career. And so he wrestled jurisdiction away from his Senate colleagues over the CAB, and he held hearings. And at those hearings, he did things like show how the flights from San Francisco to LA were half as much as from Boston to DC. And a momentum built behind these sets of arguments, so that by 1978, the Civil Aeronautics Board, a federal agency, had been closed down by legislation and shut its doors. And prices are now, since then, have been determined by market competition. Not so much entry as much, although for the most part, yes. And for that reason is why we're all raising our hands to the question of have you flown recently. So those are some examples of how ideas do battle with vested interests to bring about political change. And there are lots of examples of this. In the 70s, we had deregulation of airlines, pipelines, railroads, truckings. In the 80s, we had lower taxes and fewer deductions built into the income tax code. In the 90s, as I mentioned, we had spectrum license auctions. We also had electricity deregulation in several states. We had welfare reform. In the 2000s, in response to the Kelo versus City New London case, we had eminent domain reform in 23 states. In the 10s, we have right to work laws in Indiana and Michigan, and we have the taxi cab deregulations, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. All of these episodes of political change were beneficial, and all of them occurred despite the presence of vested interests in the status quo. So, a couple of common themes here. What do I mean by beneficial change? I mean changes in the rules of the game, changes in what we call institutions that give people better incentives. Better incentives, for example, not to be rent-seeking, but instead to be profit-seeking. And those better incentives leading to social gains. Second point is that you see this phrase, high causal density. My wife is always telling me, why don't you speak in ordinary terms? You know, so that Lorenzo can understand you. My boy, he's 5 now, kindergartner. And I said, well, I mean, sometimes you got to use more precise terminology. But there's an easy way to describe what high causal density means. It's a complex process. Lots of different causes coming together at once. Each of these episodes works out slightly differently, although I think the same components are in there in each of them to varying degrees. And the third thing about all these episodes that I've been talking about, and this is where we kind of get closer to the point about ordinary folks, is all these episodes are, third point there, top-down. These ivory tower types, these elected officials in faraway capitals, changing the rules and people working within those rules respond to it. All right, so that suggests the question, what about the bottom up? How might bottom up political change happen? And as I mentioned at the opening, what I would like to do is incorporate some public choice theory into this argument. All right. Using public choice theory to think about bottom up change, I'm going to talk about 3 individuals. The first is James M. Buchanan, one of my professors at George Mason University, who founded public choice theory. And for much of his career, he spent his time talking about arguments and building theories and making arguments that attempted to counter and controvert the prevailing arguments of the day in economics and policy. And those prevailing arguments of the day included things like, well, if there's a good that people want and makes them better off, but that good is a public good, and by public good, the prevailing theory would say it has characteristics of being non-rival and non-exclusive. We don't have to get into exactly what that means, but if you're following, a public good won't be provided through market exchange, through open competition. It'll be underprovided. And Buchanan wrote a paper in 1965 called An Economic Theory of Clubs. And he wasn't necessarily disputing this non-rival, non-exclusive point and how it might apply to certain goods that people want. But he was disputing the conclusion of the mainstream, which was if it's a public good, then governments have to provide it. If it's a road, or if it's a police force, or if it's a swimming pool, governments have to provide it. And what Buchanan said, he started analyzing the situation, and without getting into all of the details, his punchline was, look, we actually have good reason to expect, and we actually have a good bit of history to conclude, that people routinely agree to joint or group contracts through which they voluntarily produce public goods. The house I mentioned to you that I bought last year, it's in a homeowners association. And by signing the contract on that house, I signed on to the terms of that homeowners association's covenant. And that's a voluntary arrangement. Now it's a pretty high cost to exit that arrangement because I have to sell my house and move. But that's ultimately a voluntary arrangement. And the homeowners association provides all sorts of things that mainstream of economics would say are public goods. And it happens through people interacting with each other on a sort of bottom-up ground level. Right? Second person I want to talk about is Eleanor Ostrom. Eleanor Ostrom was a former president of the Public Choice Society like me. I got to meet her through that capacity. Wonderful lady. She won the Nobel Prize in 2010 for her work that showed how it's not just goods that people can produce through voluntary interaction, but it's also rules. Institutions can. People who interact with each other, she noticed through history that they repeatedly tend to use the local knowledge of their situations to establish mutually beneficial rules. Most of her examples had to do with natural resources that had essentially open access to them. And the prevailing thought at the time was, well, if there's open access, people are going to overuse it. But what Ostrom pointed out was that people would like to avoid that outcome of overusing it. And through repeated interaction with each other and some trial and error and some innovation of different ways of doing things, they oftentimes find different rules of access besides open access that lead to not overutilization of the resource, but efficient utilization of the resource. So that's the second person I want to talk about in terms of the bottom up. And the third person is a guy named Richard Cornwell. Richard Cornwell wasn't properly a public choice scholar, but his work in a book called Reclaiming the American Dream, which was published in 1965, fits with this sort of bottom-up story. And what he said is that a lot of the services that governments provide, public assistance, for example, disaster aid, for example, guarantees of student loans, for example, education of children, for example. What he found is that there are a lot of, throughout big chunks of history, a lot of those services that governments provide, they were provided by voluntary associations. And he argued through this book, Reclaiming the American Dream, that they can continue to be, or they can again be, provided by voluntary associations. So here are three scholars, the sum of their work suggesting a way that we can understand dispersed voluntary repeated interaction of people leading to beneficial outcomes. And I would like to suggest that they can be used as a foundation for thinking about bottom-up political change. We find that people can collectively produce goods through Buchanan's work, voluntarily, services through Cornwell's work, and mutually beneficial rules through Ostrom's work. And how do they do that? It's not through government provision. It's instead through communication with each other, the sharing of ideas, through trial and error, through innovation with each other, the application of entrepreneurship, and through voluntary agreement, contracting with each other, where people have a way to opt out. Right? It's not from the top down, and it's not necessarily government doing it. Okay, so where do you fit into this? Where do you fit in? Where do you fit in the college student? You're like, Lopez, I have an exam next week. I don't have. Give me something, Well, yeah, here it comes. Where do you fit in? The parent. You say, Lopez, my kids have an exam next week. Don't you know I have things to do? How about the preacher? How about the artist? If you're a content producer, guess what? Your content is an idea. What about the billionaire philanthropist? All of these folks have time, talent, and treasure that they have to figure out how they're going to use. They have to figure out how they're going to utilize it. How can they utilize it towards bottom-up political change? How can you be an agent of beneficial change? Third point, then, is that most people contribute to ideas in their daily lives. As a consequence of that, we all can be political entrepreneurs in the sense of exerting pressure on political institutions, in the sense of surmounting an inefficient status quo. So I'm going to talk about a few examples for a little while. Many of these I think will be familiar to you. First set of examples can be called market entrepreneurs, whose ideas force change in political institutions. It's a very common phenomenon. So, for example, ride-sharing companies, Sidecar, Uber, and Lyft. These were innovations that were made possible ultimately by Ronald Coase, I would argue, but that didn't really have space in the regulatory framework that governed for-pay transportation. And so therefore, by the innovation of it, and by the adoption of this innovation by large numbers of people, the legal and regulatory framework had to change. It had to adapt to this innovation. Khan Academy. Do you know that Sal Khan started? Do you know how Sal Khan started his company? Through YouTube videos. For what purpose? Teach his cousins how to do calculus. Yeah, and then he found out that people were watching other people besides his cousins, didn't he? Yeah, and that one thing led to another, and he's got thousands of videos up now. Well, it's not just thousands of videos that he's produced. He's also produced tensions in the way education is delivered, and the legal and regulatory framework that surrounds that delivery of education. And he since actually has become a proponent of different ideas for how to produce education. Market entrepreneur. Food trucks. Yummy. Right? There wasn't a regulatory space for food trucks when they became critical mass. And there was tensions too, like, hey, I own a restaurant and there's a food truck parked right outside. First of all, that's not cool. Secondly, can I do anything about it? And with some controversy along the way, those regulatory spaces, and I would argue even more importantly than the informal norms that govern how food trucks operate have been developed, and they've become mature now. What hasn't quite developed yet is how are we going to handle the driverless car? It basically works already. It's not far off where it's going to become our reality, right? You will tell your driverless car to go pick up your Uber customer, and stop along at your favorite food truck along the way while you watch Khan Academy videos to expand your education. Right? But the legal and regulatory framework for driverless cars needs to be developed before that happens. Here's an innovation that is going to result, there's no doubt about it, in beneficial political change. You guys are innovators. Whether you realize it or not, this also is in your future. Some other guy, some other time in the future, could be giving a talk just like this, and you will be on that screen. If your dreams don't scare the hell out of you, well, they should. All right. Second set of examples. You might call these evasive entrepreneurship, or possibly subversive entrepreneurship. Ideas that creatively destruct the status quo by working around them or working outside them. Homeschooling, I think, is a big example of this. Especially when it got to be big numbers. The education establishment is having to respond. Free cities. What is free cities all about? It's about saying, let's get rid of the entire status quo and let's establish a new set of rules for people to voluntarily migrate to. One of my personal favorites, fashion knockoffs. In particular, fashion counterfeits. Because fashion knockoffs, copying of fashion designs is not illegal, but counterfeiting of fashion designs violates trademark and is therefore operating outside the formal reach of the law. Arguably to great benefit of consumers, questionably over whether it's the benefit of the genuine producers. Does anybody remember what Napster is? These were the first file sharing guys getting around copyright law for sharing music and movies. They lost a big Supreme Court case, but they still have lots of fans out there. Yeah. Somebody was clapping. Yeah. What about this guy? Yeah. He's supervised now, to say the least. He's supervised now, but he is putting pressure on the formal legal and regulatory framework surrounding what are now illicit substances. So this group of folks does that. They put pressure on political institutions, and part of the way that they do that is they have an influence on public attitudes and beliefs about what the rules of the game should be. You can make these examples without endorsing these activities, without endorsing the people who either clearly do or might be breaking the law. It's not about endorsement, it's about understanding. Third set, communications entrepreneurship. Ideas that shape people's views of the accepted role of government. This was quite a story, wasn't it? A couple years ago, Congress and lots of big companies and lots of big important people who pontificate about what the rules of the game should be wanted to pass the Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect Intellectual Property Act. And you know what happened? There was a bottom-up groundswell of opposition to it. And it didn't go. Important part of that was the social network media and the online media through which people shared those ideas and built that momentum of opposition. So this category does interact with the previous categories of technology and subversion or evasion. How about anonymous? Similarly speaking, there's information out there that for whatever reason, good or bad, again, I'm not endorsing, that our elected leaders and their representatives don't want out. And there's other people, they go by anonymous, who got that information and are getting it out. And whatever you think of that particular dynamic, it is shaping people's views of the accepted role of government. Khan Academy, too. Do you know he has videos on what is Obamacare? Mm-hmm. So again, some overlap. And I think also this is where artists come in. Artists and content makers, which in a lot of ways includes all of us. Photographers, novelists, filmmakers. You know who the guy there is on the right? Does anybody know? That's a young Steven Spielberg. Right. Steven Spielberg, I think, is included in this class of people that, and these other examples too, that F.A. Hayek called intellectuals, middleman of ideas. So think about how people, ordinary folks, come to their understandings of history, in particular maybe history of World War II period, and think about the Spielberg movies. Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List. Right? I'm probably leaving a couple out. Content producers can be communication entrepreneurs that put pressure on political institutions by virtue of influencing the way ordinary folks think about the accepted role of government and the status quo of political institutions. Social entrepreneurship, too, I would say. Social entrepreneurship, because there's this hybrid of market activity and providing services that governments typically provide, and therefore directly competing with governments. Meet Hannah, founder of Bangs, which is a shoe company, and she devotes a portion of her profits to people in developing countries along the supply chains of shoes. Her model is a lot like Tom's. Think about Whole Foods. 5% of Whole Foods profits go towards charities that the board of directors has picked out. Think about fair trade. Fair trade is the idea that consumers in rich countries can pay a little bit more for their coffee or a little bit more for their soccer balls, and the proceeds go towards the poorest folks on the supply chain of those goods and services. Right? So, where does all this give us? Where does all this put us? I think it's not controversial to say that all of us in the room would prefer beneficial change to the alternative, right? I'm sort of stacking the deck there with my language. We prefer beneficial change to the continuing of the status quo or towards more harmful change. Right? How do we get that? Well, we each have a role in doing so. Chapter 7 of the book lays out some basic principles for how each of us can be better political entrepreneurs. The billionaire philanthropist, the artist, the college student, the content producer. And the four principles are listed there. Focus on your comparative advantage, gain a deep knowledge of the market, get the greatest marginal return, get lucky. I won't go into the details of those principles. If you want to get into those, you can read the book, right? Or I can talk to you about them at the Barstool meeting. But I wouldn't be the optimistic public choice guy if I didn't end off on what I hope will be a motivational set of points. And that is that in addition to these 4 principles, you got to have a little bit of belief that you can have a role in things getting better. Because you do. I'm inspired by Ludwig von Mises, an Austrian economist, who says, he who wants to improve conditions must propagate a new mentality, not merely a new institution. Participate in the communication and the flow of ideas with each other. And by doing so, you'll be contributing to that better mentality, that new mentality. And you should have the conviction that that will matter. It matters what you say. It matters what example you are. It matters how you live your life. F.A. Hayek, the intellectuals guy, he says we must make the building of a free society once more an intellectual adventure, a deed of courage. You should have the courage that what you do matters to politics, and not just leave it up to elected folks in faraway capitals to take care of things for you. You should understand political change, and you should be an agent of beneficial change. Thank you. Professor Ortega has a microphone.
So if there's any questions, I'll go around and give you the microphone.
Hi. Could you comment on Bitcoin in the context of what you've been talking about?
It belongs here. Yes. Yeah. Well, it belongs there because it's an alternative currency that competes with the official currency, the dollar, and therefore is putting pressure on the status quo that makes use of the dollar, and and the interests of the status quo that make using the dollar in their interests.
How can you estimate what's likely to happen?
Can I predict the future with what's going to happen with Bitcoin? No, I don't think so. But there are certain variables that are changing now that affect how Bitcoin will affect the future of Bitcoin. And one of them is the value of the U.S. dollar and what's going to be happening to that as the Fed figures out what to do with their balance sheet and the monetary base as big as it is right now. I think maybe computing costs.
Thank you.
Because you have to mine the coins. It could be a factor as well. Specifically what's going to happen with Bitcoin, I don't know. I just don't know. Yeah. But that's where I would put it. Yeah.
I'd like to ask your immediate observations on two thoughts. Number one, that what I consider to be beneficial change may not be what other people consider to be beneficial change. Hence, there's a more competitive element entering in here. And secondly, that even if I agree with your beneficial change, there are scarcity of resources, and that the extent to which your beneficial change is achieved, my beneficial change is not.
It's a tough question, a tough couple of questions. And the reason it's tough is because we don't have a standard that applies to everybody for what is beneficial. In economics, we teach the standards of efficiency, the Pareto criteria and the Kaldor-Hicks criteria. In principle, we could do a cost-benefit analysis for every set of changes, and we could elicit information from people about their willingness to pay for that change or pay for that change not to happen. And we could, therefore, in principle, aggregate all of those willingness to pays. But so much of what happens in the political sphere involves goods or involves things about life that are not traded in markets and therefore don't have market prices attached to them. And the mechanisms by which we can elicit people's information about how much they would be willing to pay for or against are